Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varmblog. And I'm going to do, for a second time, an essay by Mike MacNair called Lukács, the Philosophy Trap. I realized when I did this the first time for this series, Radical Engagements, I started with it. I had been familiar with this essay from before. And in fact, in July of 2020, I did an episode with Doug Lane on Pop the Left called Lukács and the Philosophy Trap, referencing this. I've gone back and re-listened to what I said in 2020, and also realized that I needed to cover the James Turley and Lawrence Parker and Chris Cutrone discourses before covering this essay for its full context to be understood. And then we're going to cap this off with a final response from Chris. I am ambivalent about Lukács. I was more anti-Lukács in the teens than I am today, but I still think taking on Lukács on critically and just celebrating him as like a voice of Orthodox Marxism is a fool's errand. I don't even think Orthodox Marxism is a particularly coherent concept. And I've gone into that before. I was influenced a lot by James Turley's article, less so by Mike MacNair's, which I found a little bit vulgar at the time. But I'm going to go into it because I do think there are things to talk about here. And then we'll finish up this series with why still read Lukács by Chris Cutrone. I'll also link in the show notes the Diet Soap episode. I think it was actually Zero Books Pop the Left version that we did 4 years ago. For those of you who are deep in the Varn lore, you may know I've done 3 iterations of Pop the Left. One for Doug Lane, myself, and a former member of the Socialist Equity Party, Nick Pell, who became a right-winger later on. A series, Pop the Left, from 2012 to 2014, roughly. Then I did another series with Doug Lane that was aiming to be more of a historical series, but we kind of lost the plot on that. I wanted to do something akin to what the podcast The Measures Taken, and if you don't listen to it, you should, did on the development of socialist ideas, concept to concept. Doug and I often disagreed. Doug wanted to do things that were more contemporary, and we went back and forth on that. But this is one of the issues that we talked about. And then there was a brief Pop the Left with Sublation that I did off and on, but I think there's only 3 episodes with me on it. There are other people who did it. Pop the Left is Doug Lane's intellectual property. Anyway, so I'll put a link to that old show in the show notes for you, and let's get going. I also wouldn't start this one without having first actually listened to or read the Turley, Lawrence Parker, Chris Cutrone exchanges. All right. Let's make this a little bigger for you guys. Lukács, the Philosophy Trap by Mike MacNair. Georgi Lukács provided a theoretical overkill for bureaucratic centralism of groups like the SWP, argues Mike MacNair. So MacNair doubles down on what Lawrence Parker and Lawrence Parker's response accused him of. This article is at least partially a response to Lawrence Parker's criticisms made by James Turley and by me, though what I wrote was no more than a casual reference about the 1920s Marxist philosophers Georgi, Lukács, and Karl Korsch. Now, I've picked up at Marxist Unity Group and Cosmonaut Magazine also have hostility to Lukács and Korsch and blame Lukács and Korsch for things that I think you shouldn't blame Lukács and Korsch for. This idea that Lukács and Korsch were corrupting and leading towards something that was anti-Second International and is not a whole lot more intellectually rigorous than complaining about how Western Marxism has some kind of deep purity fetish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a particularly serious critique. But I do think there are problems with Korsch being decontextualized. Korsch was responding in his time and his valorization of the Critique of the Goethe program to the literally Lassallean revival led by Bernstein when he re-entered the SPD after leaving the SPD during World War I, for the Görlitz program, which was kind of a disaster in the long run. So when we take Korsch out of his context without understanding his reception history, etc., we do perform a problem, and that's more than Korsch's Hegelian idealism going on there. It is later readers reappropriating Korsch for different means. Often, when Verso does one of those radical thinkers, they don't contextualize what the original works were about, particularly if it's before the New Left. And this is a problem. Anyway, back to the text. It was partially self-critical. My casual reference was an over-summary. Comrade Turley, who wrote in much more depth about Lukács's philosophical ideas, can speak for himself. But I defend the main line of my arguments against Comrade Barker's criticism. This is, however, a work in progress, attempting to summarize a larger argument. I am not primarily concerned with the philosophical questions, though I am inevitably going to talk about them to some extent. I am primarily concerned with the political questions which affect present-day politics, what Moshe Machover has called actually existing Leninism, aka what Trotskyism was in Britain in the aughts and early aught-teens, which has become a lot less relevant to us today, whereas Lukács, who's a key figure in the culmination of something you might call like an orthodox Marxism and the debates over Marxist humanism versus structural Marxism, there's no way that you can avoid Lukács, whether you like him or not, or know all of his political history or not, if you get very deep into Marxism. And like Althusser, Lukács was a Marxist-Leninist of a particular variety who was both trying to walk a fine line and critique Stalinism, Soviet Marxist-Leninism, both in Stalin's period and in the Khrushchevian period, which they both saw as somewhat right-wing. Anyway, but that does lead to both of them being mealy-mouthed in different ways, even though they were often opposed to each other. All right, so I get the problem with actually existing Leninism and what you have to deal with Lukács. I have commented casually in more than one place that the standard left critique of the Second International is that it was characterized by a mechanical and undialectical Marxism, and that the mechanical and undialectical Marxism meant that the collapse in 1914 was foreordained by the philosophical position of the Second International. Yeah, I think that's foolish. I think the problems are not ideological or philosophical. They were structural, as well as ideological. We can get into that later. And that this idea is linked to the views of the ultra-lefts against whom Lenin in 1920 wrote Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Comrade Parker in his critique provides an additional point along the same lines. He suggests that the Second International failed to develop a Marxist critique of culture. I mean, it did. There were attempts to, it wasn't settled. And hence its cultural activities involved the right theoretical eclecticism. It absolutely did, which borrowed from various cultural approaches of the bourgeoisie, and thus this is also part of the story of the collapse. My view is that this general approach to the collapse of the Second International, that it was insufficiently theoretical or philosophically Marxist, foresees the creation of mass competing groups, sects founded on the basis of theoretical agreements. Such sects can never get beyond the organizational character of the Socialist Workers' Party, the bête noire of the CPGB Provisional Committee. Even if in this situation, the revolutionary crisis that may temporarily become rather large, like the Iranian Fedayeen. Nonetheless, they remain in their thinking at the level of an organization of a few thousand or less. Usually, these organizations get no larger than 5,000 people. Even in large organizations and the national characters such as the DSA, you're still dealing with, usually between 50 and 100,000 people. You see this at the high point of the SPUSA. You saw this at the high point of the Socialist Party of America. And you saw this in the Students for a Democratic Society, which hit around 60K, I believe. I think the DSA is currently hovering officially somewhere around 50 something K. It's hard to know in numbers. Their internal documentation is actually quite good, and it's quite easy to get, but they're not is quite public about their numbers these days. Anyway, this is often a problem, but nonetheless, there is a way in which sectarian thinking has a natural limit, and you have to acknowledge that limit. Nonetheless, they remain in their thinking at level of organization of a few thousand or less, and hence break up or are actually unable to politically lead the broad masses under coalitions conditions of a revolutionary crisis. Just don't have the objective strength. Comrade Parker's critique is that I and James Turley, in identifying Lukács's history and class consciousness in Lenin and the course of Marxism and philosophy as the most explicit and systematic defenders of the view that the problem with the Second International is that it was mechanical Marxism, undialectical, insufficiently Hegelian, and so on, have failed to grasp that these writings were transitional towards Leninism from an earlier ultra-leftism. Instead, we have mistakenly identified them with the tradition of the ultra-left, going back to Anton Pannekoek and the mass strike debate of 1911, 1912, and beyond. I'm going to be honest. This is a problem that I've often had with Mike MacNair, is that I think he is uncharitable towards things he considers ultra-left positions in ways that actually hurt his analysis of certain things that happened. He also tends to call people Bakuninist who aren't. This is a common thing with people who read MacNair. Or objectively Bakuninist, etc. And beyond, perhaps, to the revolutionary syndicalist George Sorel. He accuses me in particularly of imagining that John Rhee accurately reports Lukács when he does not. On the first point, I am happy to self-criticize for identifying Lukács and Korsch in the 1920s as simply philosophers of the communist ultra-left. And Korsch was more related to the ultra-left than Lukács, and I think this is like, we can get into that. He was actually in a party that was, sympathetic to council communism, the KAPD. But with Lukács, you never have such formal affiliations in any serious way. It is certainly true that at the time of Lukács' writing History and Class Consciousness as published, and at the time of Korsch's writing Lenin and Philosophy, these authors were trying to theorize Lenin, including the Lenin of left-wing communism. It would be more precise, however, to say that they were trying to theorize the conception of the Communist Party expressed in the resolution, the role of the Communist Party in the Proletarian Revolution, adopted by the Comintern in 1920, and the resolution, the organizational forms of the Communist parties, adopted in 1921, and that they were also trying to theorize what we now know, thanks to the work of Lars T. Lee and others, to be completely false history of what is to be done, and the split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903. That is, that 1903 created a separate Bolshevik party, which applied military-style discipline, and that it was because of this separate Bolshevik party of a new type that the Russian Revolution could be victorious. What this myth did was to project back certain aspects of the practice of the Russian party in the Civil War period, 1918 and 1921. And I think MacNair actually is good on this. I think MacNair's right that there's a tendency to view Bolshevism after the ABCs of Communism, or the Bolshevik platform of 1918, which is a platform I actually kind of like, into the kind of militarism that you see in that period, which was a Civil War period, and then the consolidation of the structures of that, cell structures for the party, faction ban, slate voting for the leadership, etc., to all of the Bolshevik Party's development. It's kind of a problem. It's also, not completely fair. It's not fair to pretend that didn't matter, that they did that, or that there weren't reasons why they did that. And I think that's probably something to think about in regards to MacNair's own limitations. But anyway, what this myth did was project back certain elements of the practice of the Russian Party in the Civil War period, 1918-1921, onto a completely different practices of the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP, and it developed into a party down to 1918. It is commonplace among critics of the myth, particularly those influenced by Trotskyism, to blame all this false history on Grigory Zinoviev. I mean, a lot of it is Zinoviev's fault, even though he was part of the left opposition, and hence to push its development further back in time to after Lenin. It is true that Zinoviev's 1923, The History of the Bolshevik Party, is partly the creation of the myth. Yes, it is. I mean, Zinoviev has a lot to answer for. Written as it was to slant the history in favor of the views of the Troika against Trotsky and Trotskyism in 1923 and 1924. However, if Zinoviev was to blame, our authors would be writing before this falsification, but the false narrative of the long, separate history of the Bolsheviks is present in Lenin's left-wing communism and present in the argument about the role of the Communist Party and its organizational nature in the Comintern, which produced the 1920 and 1921 resolutions. The 1921 resolution was in fact drafted by Lenin and Otto Kusinin. I would add that Lukács in History of Class Consciousness and in Lenin in Course of Marxism and Philosophy did in defending this Leninism draw for intellectual resources on the idea from the existing critique of the Second International and Social Democratic Party Journey Center developed on the pre-war mass action left. My discussion here is partly of Lukács, mainly of his context, and I will leave Course to one side on this occasion. Kalinikos. Oh, Kalinikos is always behind this period because everyone really hated the SWP. I begin by returning to the present and to Alex Kalinikos' infamous article, What Sort of Party Do We Need? This is a good example of how Lukács is used by the modern far left to defend 1921 Leninism. So revolutionaries still confront the problem of how the working class, this is Kalinikos, and the oppressed can match and ultimately smash the concentrated power of the state sustained by their own self-organization. It is this that lies behind the question of the party, how to marry what Antonio Gramsci called the spontaneous movement of the revolutionary masses in directing and organizing the will of the center. Something that Bordiga hated. Anyway, a little later in the article, but it was George Lukács in his little book Lenin, subtitled A Study on Unity of His Thought, who highlights this particular importance to him of the question of the party. Lenin was the first and for a long time the only important leader and theoretician who tackled the problem of its theoretical roots and therefore at the decisive practical point, that of organization, that of political organization. And Marx and Engels are a little bit vaguer on this stuff. Theoretical roots. Where is Lenin, according to Lukács, talking about the party question at its theoretical roots? It is certainly not in materialism and imperial criticism. This is, of course, a reference to what is to be done. For Lukács, that is, the conception of what is to be done has inaugurated a new philosophical epoch in the history of the workers' movement. Is What Is to Be Done a philosophical book? Kalinikos again. In his masterwork, History and Class Consciousness, Lukács again highlights the strategic importance of the question of organization as addressed by Lenin. Organization is a form of mediation between theory and practice, and as in every dialectical relationship, the terms of the relations only acquire concreteness and reality in and by virtue of this mediation. The ability of the organization to mediate between theory and practice is seen most clearly, but the way in which it manifests a much greater, finer, and more confident sensitivity towards divergent trends than any other sector of political thought and action. On the level of pure theory, the most desperate views and tendencies are able to coexist peacefully Antagonisms expressed only in the form of discussions, which can be contained within the framework of one and the same organization without disrupting it. But no sooner are these same questions given organizational form than they turn to be sharply opposed and even incompatible. Here, Callinicos offers Lukács as providing the philosophical justification for the ban on permanent factions in the Socialist Workers' Party. Actually, I mean, and that comes from the Bolshevik Party of 1918 forward. The same argument goes to justify that the SWP, since its forerunner, the International Socialist, abandoning entry into the Labor Party in the late 1960s, always regarded it as a matter of principle that the SWP should exist as a fully separate organization and not as a faction of a broader party. That this is based on theory, i.e. Marxist-Leninism, Tony Cliff thought, revolution from below, state capitalism, deflected permanent revolution. Those are all Tony Cliff innovations. The organizational separation of the SWP is a fundamental principle, but it's equally it's a coherence, meaning its agreement on theory in the absence of permanent factions is a fundamental principle. Yes. As we see later, Lukács also provides a justification for the view that permanent activism, running around after every event that happens and so on, and internal debate reduced to how to do activism is fundamental to the conception of the party. Yeah, aka actionism. Now, it's interesting that the people inspired by Lukács go on to critique actionism. That's their early Frankfurt School of Habermas. Well, Habermas is there, but of Horkheimer and Adorno. But anyway, is Callinicos here misreporting Lukács? Was John Rees misreporting Lukács in his book on the dialectic? The answer, I have to say, is no. Precisely, they are due to the reason that Comrade Parker correctly criticizes me for. Lukács is in these passages attempting to theorize Leninism, meaning by that 1921 Leninism, as opposed to the practice of the Bolsheviks down to 1918, before Lukács was really involved. Yeah, this is a problem. And this gets a little bit closer to what Chris Cutrone was on, although I'm sure Chris fundamentally disagrees with this, and I do think this ends up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but nonetheless, there is a real problem here. Anyway, back to this text. The SWP, and before it, the old official communist parties, various Maoist parties, and most Leninist or vanguardist Trotskyist parties, does faithfully follow the model laid out in 1920 and 1921 Comintern resolutions. Yep, and it's a problem that they follow that model. Borga's Leninism doesn't follow that model entirely, although they do incorporate parts of it. That's a problem for them too. Over and above that, the modern Lukács users have adopted the philosophical theorization of 1921 Leninism, which, so far as one accepts the theorization, forecloses the possibility of thinking that this approach to organization might be wrong, or at least wrong for conditions which are not those of 1919 to 1921. Yeah, and I actually kind of think that what Lenin ended up doing in 1919, 1921 was kind of foreclosed. If the Bolsheviks wanted to survive, they kind of had to do it. But making that normative practice forever and ever, amen, because it won in a specific context of which we are not in, is a weird thing to do. Anyway, I have used elsewhere the expression theoretical overkill, in particular of J.S. Banerjee's theoretical critique of the Indian Naxalites. Of J.S. Banerjee's theoretical critique of the Indian Naxalites. Well, there's many. What I mean here is that it is possible to over-theorize critiques of false positions. And by over-theorizing, you can fall into the opposite political error to that of the people you are criticizing in the first place. More specifically, in relation to the theorization, which is about the grounds of belief, and particularly the employment of Kantian, Hegelian, and post-Kantian philosophical arguments about the grounds of belief, you create a closure against adverse empirical evidence. Yes, you do. And this is something that I argue that I've implied it with Chris, because Chris was always saying, well, Marxism is not empiricism, which it is not. But it is not anti-realism, and it is not purely an ideological and ideational commitment to a set of rights or values. Whether we think those rights and values are good, Marx did, I do too, for the most part, does not mean that we think that it's primarily the only thing at stake. After all, those values emerge in a specific context. necessary for specific mode of production, and with promises which that mode of production limits. Anyway, it seems to me that this problem of theoretical overkill affects this particular use of Lukács, the party question. What Lukács, of course, were trying to theorize in history and class consciousness and Marxism and philosophy is the party question. Why does a working class need a party? But in addition, why does a working class need the sort of party which is proposed in the 1920 and 21 resolutions? There is involved here a shift away from Marx's and Engels' conception of the party, which had begun before 1914, but is here accentuated. Yes. In essence, the party question arises from Marx and Engels because it is insufficient for the working class to simply carry on in trade union struggles or build cooperatives, the view of Proudhonist, Oranites, and British trade unionists, pure and simple. The argument is that the working class as a class, for itself after all, needs to intervene in high politics to form its own independent political platform and to seek its own political power. Yeah, although not to serve in coalitions with other people with political power. That's pretty clear in Marx and Engels, particularly in the letters. This idea is, in fact, not original to Marx and Engels. It is a legacy of left Chartism of the 1830s to early 1840s. To some degree, I would agree with that. The argument is consistent thread in Marx and Engels' political arguments from the 1846 address of the Democratic Communists to Brussels to Mr. Fergus O'Connor on the occasion of his elective victory through the Communist Manifesto, the inaugural address of the First International, Marxist speech at the 1871 Congress of the International, the 1880 program for the French Parti Ouvrier, left party. It's strikingly clear where I think this is probably the closest. I said recently that Marx endorsed this. Marx wrote a good part of it. This is probably the closest thing to late Marx's political program is the left party platform. The Erfurt program cannot be said to be endorsed by Marx because he was dead. But that's also pretty close because it goes back to certain things in the left party platform. All right, program, excuse me. A strikingly clear account of the issue is given in an 1871 letter of Marx to Frederick Bolte. Quote, this is a Marx quote. The attempt in particular factory or even a particular industry to force a shorter working day out of the capitalists by strikes, etc., is a purely economic movement. On the other hand, the movement to force an 8-hour day, etc., law is a political movement. And in this way, out of the separate economic movements of the workers, there grows up everywhere a political movement, that is to say, a movement of the class with the object of achieving its interest in the general forum and possessing a general force of compulsion. In the Second International, there was a degree of confusion over the issue. We can see this in the first place in Rosa Luxemburg's pamphlet, The Mass Strike. A loss of the understanding of the working class needs to go beyond the trade union struggle to addressing the question of political power in society as a whole, and what is lost is visible in the formulation. Separation of the political and economic struggle and the independence of each is nothing but an artificial product of the parliamentary period. And in the peaceful, normal course of bourgeois society, the economic struggle is split into multiple individual struggles. As soon as a period of revolutionary struggle commences, that is, as soon as the masses appear at the scene of conflict, the breaking up of the economic struggle into many parts, as well as an indirect parliamentary form of the political struggle, ceases. We can see a related but different set of confusion in the 1909 discussion on whether or not the Labor Party should be admitted to the Second International. Lenin's report of the meeting of the International Socialist Bureau discusses this. Kralkatsky has recommended the admission of labor on the grounds that, although the party does not have a socialist class struggle perspective, nonetheless, by being organized independently, it breaks with the bourgeoisie. Lenin correctly says that organizing a labor party on its own does not in itself break with the bourgeoisie. Absolutely not. Cutrone would say the same thing. In practice, labor is not a party which is really independent of liberals and does not pursue an independent class policy. However, he says that labor should be allowed to affiliate because under the rules, trade unions, for example, may do so. Although the party does not yet represent a political break with the bourgeoisie, the as of yet unrealized logic of organizing independently does. To avoid confusing the potential and the realized, labor should be admitted as an organization of trade unions. Radek, representing the left as opposed to the center of the International, argues that the labor should not be admitted because it is not a socialist party. And asked, is United Labor Party, which is not socialist, possible? We say no. Without socialism, the working class is a heterogeneous mix of different categories. Lukács, later defending his position against critics, argues that there are two tasks, one in the broad organization of the Labour Party and the other propaganda for socialism. Hence, it meant the Labour Party to the International as a broad party of labor, and the distinct job of the communists, organized in the Social Democratic Federation, is to propagandize for socialism. In this argument, he has merged the idea of a fully independent political organization of the working class into the idea of propaganda for socialism, and hence lost sight of it. The Comintern. Confusion continued in the Comintern Congress theses of 1920 and 1921. In essence, the view of the function of the party in these theses is to centralize and organize the direct class struggle, strikes, mass actions, and so on, pointing towards a civil war. Every class struggle is a political struggle. The aim of the struggle, which inevitably turns into civil war, is the conquest of political power. And the same class struggle demands in the same way the centralization and common leadership of the different forms of the proletarian movement, trade unions, cooperatives, work committees, cultural work, elections, and so forth. Only a political party can be such a unifying and leading center. But also the party's role is to represent the class, quote, until the time when state power has been conquered by the proletariat and the proletariat has established its rule and for all and secured it from the bourgeois restoration. Until that time, the Communist Party will only have the minority of the working class organized in its flank. And then it must have iron military order. Yeah, this is a problem. The Communist International is of the opinion that, particularly in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Communist Party must be built on the basis of iron proletarian centralism. To lead the working class successfully in the long and hard civil wars which have broken out, the Communist Party must create an iron military order in its own ranks. And Lenin in 1920, a political party can only comprise a minority of the class in the same way that a really existing class-conscious worker only forms a minority of workers in any capitalist society. Therefore, we are forced to recognize that the great masses of workers can only be led and guided by a conscious minority. Yeah, this is a problem for Kautsky and other people, and we'll get to why later. And from the 1921 thesis is, the different levels of the party apparatus must decide whether any given question should be publicly discussed by individual comrades in the press and the pamphlets, and in what form and to what extent. If the decision of the organization or the leading party body is to view certain other members incorrect, these comrades must not forget, when they speak or act in public, that to weaken or break unity of the common front is the worst breach of discipline and the worst mistake that can be made in a revolutionary struggle. The texts that are available in the Marxist Internet Archive, to read them has become clear that the regime of the SWP, the Orthotrots, and so on, does faithfully reflect Comintern resolutions. And they do, just early ones. The other ones are more problematic from 1927 later, and we'll get to those. I've covered them somewhat in Bordiga's thing, where they loosen up some of this and tighten up at others and increase discipline, and that leads to more purging, etc., etc., etc. Lukács in History and Class Conscience, in essence, argues that the organizational form of the party is not only necessary for practical action, but also necessary for consciousness. From Rutta's Orthodox Marxism, 1919, criticizing Engels' treatment of the dialectic and anti-Dühring, but he does not even mention the most vital interaction, namely the dialectical relation between subject and object in the historical process, let alone give it permanence that it deserves. Yet without this factor, dialectic ceases to be revolutionary. This is where Lukács does become one of these, the problem is Engels thinkers, which is why he gets recuperated by so many of the new left in a lot of ways, and that's probably inadvisable. Then, from the Marxism of Rosa Luxemburg, 1921, the party must ensure that in every phase and every aspect of the struggle, the sum total of available power of the proletariat has already been unleashed, should be mobilized, and that it should be expressed in the fighting stance of the party. The tactics of the social democracy should always be more resolute and vigorous than required by the existing power relations, and never less. This is the Lukács, the ultra-left. I don't know that I would call that ultra-left, Mike. The advocate of the so-called theory of the offensive, which the communist left, particularly in Germany, borrowed, I think, from the French General Marshal Foch. Lenin's discussion in left-wing communism about the need for retreat as well as attack is directed against this sort of thinking, even though Lenin might be doing it during the Civil War because he's trying to win a Civil War. All right, from the Methodology and Problem Organization, 1922, the Russian Revolution clearly exposes the limitations of the Western European organizations, their impotence in the face of spontaneous movements of the masses, which clearly expose the issues of mass actions and mass strikes. This is about the Russian Revolution of 1905, and again is repeating Luxemburg's argument in the mass strike. And another quote towards the methodology, Escape from the crisis, the economic solution to the crisis, can only come through the intensified exploitation of the proletariat. For this reason, the tactical theses of the Third Congress very rightly emphasized that every mass strike tends to translate into civil war and a direct struggle for power. This was written 18 months after the Marx action, which had quite clearly demonstrated that the mass strike, when launched in inappropriate circumstances, led not to civil war and direct struggle for power, but to ignominious defeat. Yeah, it really did. More. What was novel in the formation of the Communist parties was the new relation between spontaneous actions and conscious theoretical foresight. The philosophical argument here is precisely addressed in 1921 Leninism, and precisely on the basis of the false history, which says the Bolsheviks began as a separate organization in 1903. Bourgeois philosophy. Now I jump a long way back. There's a particular comment in Lukács' 1926 article, Moses Hess and the Problems of Idealist Dialectics. Quote, there is no denying the egoism that in fact play a big part in the growth of bourgeois ideology. In this sense, then, it is not wholly inappropriate to relate the critique of the bourgeois class to this question. But it must be remembered that the first great champions of this ideology, Hobbes, Mandeville, Bell, etc., Hobbes is the only one we still read, the struggle to establish new morality was a very real one. Not only was there a close connection between the war on the feudal morality and that of the Puritans when the bourgeois class was just emerging, and the elaboration of the new theoretical cornerstone of the whole bourgeois ideology, classical economics, but the ideology provided very important weapons for the bourgeois' actual class struggle. This is weird thing for anyone with knowledge of the 17th century politics to read, because Hobbes argued for the absolute power of the English monarchy and opposed the bourgeoisie or any other class having any political say. Yes, he did. Who did theorize the revolutionary politics of the bourgeoisie? According to others, particularly John Locke, who was an active Whig revolutionary in the political crisis of 1679 to 1683, went into exile and came back with William of Orange in 1688. Locke wrote in the 1670s an essay concerning the human understanding, though it was not published until 1689 because it was subversive. And that he argues that it is not the understanding of text, nor the collective authority of the church, nor political authority, which gives us reason to believe propositions. Rather, we start with the perception of the senses and then work up ideas through simple to complex categories. Following this approach, Locke argues that there is no absolute certain knowledge, only probable knowledge, but that this probabilistic knowledge is nonetheless sufficient for us to justifiably act on. Locke's view in an essay concerning human understanding became for a while the credo of the English Enlightenment, but they were also always scandalous precisely because they implied that there was no justification for the state imposing tests of religious orthodoxy. This was their original purpose in the 1670s. They were also scandalous, as a conservative wing of the ruling elite argued, because if knowledge is based on sense perceptions, that implied that any cobbler is entitled to have religious or political opinions, or even worse, a barber. Hence, the arguments were offered against Locke in the first place by Bishop Berkeley and later by Hume that actually we cannot derive knowledge from sense perception. See optical illusions and so on. And of course, it is true that we cannot get certainty from sense perception, and Locke admits it, but he says we can get probabilistic knowledge, which is sufficient for us to act on. Berkeley and Hume argue that sense perception is on sound basis. For Berkeley, therefore, since sense perception is on sound basis, we can be certain of nothing except what God has told us. Only divine revelation is a source of certainty. I used to argue with Doug Lane about this a lot. It's neither here nor there. Hume is less obvious. He says that since there's no basis for certainty, we should always be skeptics. We should not believe there is any truth. But then he says in his history, rather than his philosophical works, because there are no certain truths, therefore we should accept the conventional authority of the existing state, which is actually what skeptics usually end up doing. To claim the right as individuals to promote ideas which were against the official ideas of the state is to lead the path to civil war. Hume thus uses a critique of sense perception as a route back to the political philosophy of Hobbes. When we move into the German philosophical revolution, Kant takes the starting point from Hume. Why? It is hardly surprising. Kant is writing in the context of the Enlightenment, of the enlightened despotism of Voltaire, and the enlightened Prince Frederick the Great of Prussia. If we can see probabilism based on sense perceptions, we end up taking seriously the opinions of cobblers and barbers on religion and politics. This is a counter-Enlightenment philosophy, and it's precisely because of its political and religious commitments that the arguments are creating a closure against adverse empirical evidence. This is done precisely by making the relation between subject and object the starting point. To do so is to build at the starting point Berkeley and Hume's critique of Locke. In doing so, it immunizes theory against empirical refutation. This is quite certainly not Marx. At the early stages of the German ideology, we find the comment that, quote, the premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstractions can be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and their material conditions under which they live, both which they find them already existing and those producing the activities. These premises then must be verified in a purely empirical way. This commitment is a clear rejection of Hegel's critique of sense perception, drawn from Hume by the way of Kant, in the first place in the phenomenology of spirit, and also in the first place of the shorter logic. Its results are delivered in the mass of empirical supporting evidence found in Capital. Yes. Empirical reality is part of materialism. Sense, subject, object, and party. When we apply the subject-object starting point to the question of party, the result is, as Lukács argues, that, quote, the conscious desire for the realm of freedom can only be met consciously by taking the steps that will really lead to it. It implies the conscious subordination of the self to the collective will that is destined to bring real freedom into being, and that today is earnestly taking the first arduous, uncertain, and groping steps towards it. This conscious collective will is the Communist Party. And the discipline of the Communist Party, the unconditional absorption of the total personality in the practice of the movement, was the only possible way of bringing about an authentic freedom. Or, if every member of the party commits his whole personality, his whole existence to the party in this way, then the same centralizing and disciplinary principle will preside over the living interaction between the will of the members and that of the party leadership, and will ensure that the will and the wishes, the proposals and criticisms of the members are given due weight by the party leaders. Every decision of the party must result in action by all members of the party, and every slogan leads to deeds in which the individual members risk their whole physical and moral existence. For this reason, they are not only well placed to offer criticisms, they are forced to do so with their experience and their doubts. And post festum criticism, which is inedible at the moment, will be transformed into the exchange of concrete and general tactical and organizational experience, which will be increasingly oriented towards the future. The exchange of concrete and general tactical and organizational experience is exactly what the SWP's bureaucratic centralism produces as a substitute for real debate. Yes, it kind of does. This is a problem with Trotskyist parties, is that for all their critiques of MLs are actually more dogmatic than many MLs are, although we see the problems with that today as MLs are all over the place. But this actually leads these various bureaucratic cliques to form positions that actually mirror what they're critiquing, blah, 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 blah. I've gone over this in my critique of Trotskyism before. And people from both the SWP's opposition have explained the result is to dumb down discussion and increase the distance between the leaders and the apparatus and the lead. I do not need to blame Lukács for this crap. It is a product of the Comintern resolutions for which Lukács was merely provided the ideological support, or rather the theoretical overkill. The problem is, without rejecting the theoretical overkill, people who started out as the opponents of Stalinism find themselves doomed to mimic it in miniature. All right, yeah, which we see all the time. I do think this is a fair criticism of one part of Lukács, but I don't think you can say that this is the primary thing going on in history of class consciousness. It's a critique of an element of it that I think is valid, but it's not a critique of the whole thing. And we get a lot of quotes selected to back up this critique at the end, but a lot of this has nothing to do with what Lukács actually says. I think some of Parker's defenses actually apply, even of late Lukács, which is not a discussion here. And now we're going to get to finally finishing off this round of exploration and debates, Chris Cutrone's response. And we'll do that in another episode. And then we'll finish this up and go to something else. I think I'm finally going to do what I promised to deliver on militancy, the highest phase of alienation. And then I might also do a recent article by Nico Villarreal on materialism. So you guys signposted where we're going. But we're going to finish this. And remember, I'm doing this because I'm going to be backing and forth between different kinds of critique. I'm going to still be doing my critiques of communization and Bordiga and the discussions therein to make sure we understand that. I will be doing some anarchist historical critiques that I think are not invalid. And I'm going to be going back to stuff inspired by Mike MacNair and by Chris Cutrone in the future to discuss these. And again, both men, if they want to come on my show, are invited to, or anyone who wants to represent them. All right. But let's go back to Cutrone's response to this essay, and we'll finish off this series on the CPGB versus platypus debates on the nature of Lukács, with Lawrence Parker kind of splitting the baby or something.